Kemi Johnson discovered 3 impossible truths in the span of 1 hour that would shatter every plan she'd ever made. First, she was pregnant. 2 pink lines on a test she'd taken in a cramped Roman bathroom, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it into the sink. Second, the father wasn't some charming Italian businessman she'd met at a Milan charity auction. He was Lorenzo De Santis, Enzo to those foolish enough to use his nickname, heir to one of Italy's most feared criminal dynasties, a man whose family name made politicians stammer and police look away. And third, he was standing in her apartment right now, past her locked door, past every barrier she thought would keep her safe. His dark eyes fixed on the pregnancy test still clutched in her trembling fingers. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality that felt like a prison gate closing. "You don't get to disappear with my blood inside you," he said, his voice silk over steel, each Italian accented word deliberate and absolute. Kemi's breath caught as he moved closer, his perfectly tailored black suit making him look like he'd stepped out of a Renaissance painting, beautiful, dangerous, inevitable. "If you keep that baby," Lorenzo continued, his eyes dropping to her stomach with possessive certainty, "I'll protect you with everything I am. You'll want for nothing. Neither will our child." He took another step forward. "But if you run," his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt louder than shouting, "I'll burn Rome to ash searching for you. Every street, every hiding place, every person who helps you." His hand lifted, and for a moment Kemi thought he might touch her. Instead, he traced the air near her cheek, close enough that she felt the heat of his skin. "There is nowhere in this world you can go that I won't find you, tesoro. So choose now. Stand with me or watch everything burn." The eternal city of Rome glittered outside Kemi's window, ancient cobblestones and modern ambition tangled together like the life she'd been trying to build. She'd come here for freedom, for opportunity, to be something more than the eldest daughter everyone back in Lagos expected to follow the rules. Now she stood barefoot on cold marble, staring at a man who was about to steal every choice she had left. Lorenzo De Santis looked like sin wrapped in Italian tailoring. Dark hair, darker eyes, the kind of face that belonged on old coins and new scandals. She remembered those eyes from Milan, how they'd found her across a crowded ballroom, how he'd appeared at her side when some drunk investor wouldn't take no for an answer, how his presence alone had made the man retreat without a single word spoken. "Call me Enzo," he'd said that night, offering champagne and a smile that should have come with a warning label. She'd believed him. Believed the carefully constructed lie of the charming businessman, the art collector, the man who'd made her laugh in 3 languages and traced promises on her skin in a hotel suite that cost more than her yearly rent. "How did you get in?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I own this building." He said it like it was obvious, like of course he'd been watching, waiting, preparing. "I've owned it since 2 weeks after Milan. Since I realized you weren't just another woman I'd forget by morning." The confession should have terrified her. Instead, some traitorous part of her brain noted that he'd been protecting her even before he knew about the baby. "You've been spying on me." "Protecting you," he corrected, his accent turning the words into something almost tender. "There's a difference, Bella. Though you're about to learn that difference very well." Kemi's free hand moved instinctively to her stomach, still flat, still hiding the secret that would change everything. But Lorenzo's eyes tracked the movement like a predator following prey. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "About the pregnancy?" His smile was small, knowing. "I had my doctor at Gemelli Polyclinic flag any tests run under your name. I've known for 3 days. I wanted to give you time to process it yourself before I came." "How generous." "I thought so." He moved to her small kitchen, opened her refrigerator like he lived there, pulled out a bottle of water and handed it to her. "You need to stay hydrated. For the baby." The casual intimacy of it, the presumption that he had any right to care about her health, made anger finally cut through the shock. "You can't just walk in here and take over my life." "I'm not taking over your life, Kemi." The way he said her name, Kemi, with that Italian emphasis made it sound like a prayer. "I'm offering you mine. My protection. My resources. My name if you want it. And if I don't want any of it?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Lorenzo set down his own water bottle with deliberate care, and when he looked at her again she saw past the charm to the steel underneath. The man who'd inherited an empire built on blood and fear. "Then you're condemning our child to grow up without a father's protection. You're making yourself a target for every rival family in Italy who would love nothing more than to use you against me." He stepped closer, and this time he did touch her, his palm warm against her cheek, surprisingly gentle for a man with violence in his bloodline. "And you're breaking my heart, which I didn't think was possible until I met you." Kemi's breath hitched. This was manipulation had to be. Men like Lorenzo De Santis didn't have hearts to break. But his eyes held something raw and honest, something that looked almost like fear. I didn't plan this, he said quietly, switching to Italian, non el ho pianificato. I don't do relationships. I don't risk attachment. My world is too dangerous for that. But then one night in Milan, one woman who looked at me like I was just a man instead of a monster, and suddenly... He stopped, jaw clenched, fighting for control. Suddenly I want things I have no right to want, he finished. Like watching you grow round with my child. Like waking up next to you every morning. Like building something that isn't soaked in blood for the first time in my life. Outside, church bells rang across Rome, 7 o'clock, the city shifting from day to evening, from light to shadow. And in her small apartment, with a pregnancy test in one hand and a Mafia heir's future in the other, Kemi Johnson realized she was standing at a crossroads. She could run. Fight. Refuse. Cling to the independence she'd crossed an ocean to claim. Or she could step into the darkness with a man who promised to burn the world down before he'd let her go. The choice should have been easy. The problem was, some treacherous part of her heart was already leaning toward the fire. Kemi Johnson had always believed that silence was safer than panic. But as Lorenzo De Santis stood inside her apartment, uninvited, unannounced, undeniable, with Rome glowing behind him like a city built to outlast empires and secrets, she realized silence could also be a cage. You need to leave. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, the pregnancy test still clutched in her hand like evidence at a crime scene. Now. Lorenzo didn't move. He leaned back against her door instead, one hand sliding into his trouser pocket with the kind of lazy confidence that came from never being told no. The other rested against the doorframe, casual and territorial all at once. A man marking boundaries without needing to say so. You're shaking, he observed, his Italian accent turning the words into something between concern and assessment. Kemi lifted her chin. You broke into my home. I knocked. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. You didn't answer. So you picked my lock? I came prepared. The smile vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something colder, older. Something that had nothing to do with charm and everything to do with the weight of a name carved into Italian history with blood and power. I always do. Kemi took an involuntary step back, her free hand moving instinctively to her stomach. The gesture was protective, primal, and she regretted it the moment Lorenzo's eyes tracked the movement. For a heartbeat, the small apartment felt too cramped to contain them both, like two opposing forces pressed into a space meant for one. How far along? His voice had shifted, gone softer but no less commanding. Her pulse hammered against her throat. That's none of your business. It became my business, Lorenzo said, each word deliberate, the moment my blood started growing inside you. The statement landed like a physical blow. Not a threat, a claim. Kemi turned away from him, needing distance, needing air that didn't taste like his expensive cologne and the danger that clung to him like a second skin. She walked to the kitchen counter, gripping the cold marble edge until her knuckles went pale. I didn't plan this, she said quietly, staring at the reflection of Rome's lights in her dark window. I didn't even know who you really were. Behind her, she heard him exhale, a sound caught between frustration and something that might have been regret. Neither did I, Lorenzo said. She froze. What? He moved then, crossing her apartment with the measured grace of someone who'd learned early that rushed movements attracted attention. He stopped beside the window, close enough that she could see his reflection overlapping hers in the glass. Two strangers bound by one reckless night. You weren't supposed to matter, he continued, his gaze fixed on the city below. Milan was business. Appearances. Alliances with people whose names opened doors and closed mouths. He paused and something flickered across his face. Vulnerability maybe, or the ghost of it. You were supposed to be a complication I could walk away from. Kemi's laugh came out bitter and broken. Well, that's comforting. His jaw tightened. You're not listening. Listening to what? She whirled to face him, anger finally cutting through the fear. The part where you disappear for weeks without a word and then show up in my apartment like you have some God-given right to be here? Like you own me? I don't own you. Lorenzo's voice dropped dangerously low. But I own the consequences. And in my world, Tesoro, consequences have names. Faces. Targets painted on their backs. The endearment, Tesoro, treasure, felt like honey laced with poison. Their eyes locked across the narrow space, and the air between them crackled with everything unsaid. The night in Milan. The promises whispered in the dark. The way he'd looked at her like she was the only real thing in a room full of expensive pretense. "You don't get to decide what I do with my body," Kemi said, her voice cracking despite her determination to stay strong. Lorenzo's expression shifted, not with anger but with something far more dangerous. Understanding. "I don't threaten women," he said softly, switching to Italian for emphasis. "Non minaccio le donne. I make guarantees." He reached into his jacket and Kemi's breath caught, her body tensing for, what? A weapon. Proof of the violence everyone whispered about? Instead, he pulled out a slim manila folder and placed it on her kitchen table with the care of someone handling explosives. She stared at it like it might bite. "What is that?" "Your life," he said simply. "Before me." She didn't move to open it. Didn't want to know what he knew. Kemi Johnson, Lorenzo continued, his voice calm, factual, devastating. "Born in Lagos. Raised in London after your mother remarried. Moved to Rome 2 years ago chasing a non-profit position that paid half what you were worth." His eyes never left her face. "Private consulting now. Clean record. No family here. No emergency contacts listed anywhere." Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward. "You are very alone, Kemi?" Her stomach twisted. Not because he was wrong but because he was right. "I can make that safe," Lorenzo said. "Or I can make it impossible." With trembling hands, Kemi opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Her morning coffee shop, the route she jogged on Sundays, the small church in Trastevere where she sometimes sat just to think. There were screenshots of her bank accounts, copies of her visa paperwork, addresses of the few friends she'd made in Rome. Her entire life, catalogued and exposed. Fear coiled tight around her ribs, squeezing. "You followed me." It came out as a whisper. "You've been watching me." "I protected my interests," Lorenzo corrected. "There's a difference." She slammed the folder shut, the sound sharp in the quiet apartment. "This is insane. This is reality." He cut her off, not unkindly. "My. And now yours." He stepped closer, and this time Kemi couldn't retreat. The counter was at her back and he was in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the faint scar above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there in Milan. "The moment word spreads that you're carrying my child," Lorenzo said, lowering his voice to something almost gentle, "you stop being Kemi Johnson and become something else entirely. Leverage. A weakness. A target for every rival family in Italy who would rather see you bleeding in the Tiber than let a De Santis heir draw breath." Kemi's throat felt tight. "You're trying to scare me." "I'm trying to keep you alive." His honesty was somehow worse than any lie. "But only if you don't make me choose between you and everything my family has built." "So this is blackmail?" Her voice shook with fury and fear in equal measure. "This is survival," he said. "For both of us." The city lights reflected in his eyes, making them look endless and ancient, like Rome itself had taken human form and learned to wear Armani. "You will keep the baby." Not a question. Not a command. A statement of absolute certainty. "And you will move." "Move where?" Kemi demanded, even though part of her already knew the answer. "For now, somewhere no one can touch you. Somewhere I control every entrance, every exit, every person who comes within 100 meters. Her laugh came out sharp and desperate. "You mean a cage?" "I mean a fortress." His expression didn't change. "Call it whatever helps you sleep at night." "And if I say no?" She lifted her chin in defiance, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "If I tell you to go to hell and take your folders and your threats with you?" Lorenzo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he did something that terrified her more than any display of anger could have. He reached out slowly, deliberately, and stopped just short of touching her stomach. His palm hovered there, close enough that she felt the heat of his skin through her thin shirt. "This child," he said quietly, switching to Italian, "Questo bambino is a De Santis. A firstborn." She couldn't breathe. "In my world," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition and violence, "firstborns don't disappear. They don't get hidden. They don't grow up as footnotes in someone else's story." His hand dropped back to his side, but the ghost of it remained, a promise and a threat wrapped into one. "If you try to run," Lorenzo added, meeting her eyes with absolute certainty, "you won't get far. Not because I'm cruel, Bella, but because I'm thorough. And what's mine stays mine." Kemi stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, trapped between fury and fear and something she refused to name. She had faced adversity before. Poverty as a child. Racism in London. The loneliness of starting over in a foreign city where she'd never quite belong. But this was different. This was a man who didn't raise his voice because he'd never needed to. A man who didn't beg or bargain or chase. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who knew the world would eventually bend to him. And if I stay? The question escaped before she could stop it. Lorenzo looked at her then, not like an enemy or a possession or even a lover, but like something dangerously precious. Like a masterpiece he hadn't expected to find but now refused to lose. Then nothing in this city touches you without my permission, he said. Not a cold wind. Not a harsh word. Not a single breath drawn against you or our child. His voice dropped to something that sounded almost like a vow. You'll have everything I can give you. Protection. Resources. Respect. Everything except freedom, she said bitterly. Freedom, Lorenzo replied, is overrated when you're dead. Outside, a siren wailed faintly in the Roman night. Police or ambulance, the soundtrack of a city that had survived emperors and popes and countless smaller empires built on ambition and blood. Rome kept breathing. Kemi Johnson stood in her small apartment, looking at the man who'd just rewritten her entire future without asking, and realized with terrifying clarity that her life had crossed a line she could never uncross. Because whether she wanted him or not, whether she fought or fled, Lorenzo De Santis was not leaving. And neither was the child that had bound them together with ties stronger than love and more permanent than hate. The only question left was whether she would walk into his world willingly, or be dragged into it screaming. Either way, the ending was already written. She just had to decide what role she'd play in it. The car smelled like leather and unspoken power. Kemi sat rigid in the back seat, hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. The black sedan moved through Rome's streets with the smooth confidence of something that had never been stopped, gliding past traffic lights that seemed to turn green on command, through intersections where other cars instinctively yielded. Outside the tinted windows, the eternal city passed in fragments, golden streetlights painting ancient stone, church domes rising like promises against the night sky, fountains that had witnessed Caesars and saints and countless smaller dramas of ambition and survival. Rome had stood for millennia. But somehow, watching Lorenzo's profile in the dim light, Kemi had the unsettling feeling that tonight, the city was bending to him. She hadn't agreed to leave. Not in words. But when four men in dark suits had materialized outside her building without introduction, when Lorenzo had draped his jacket over her shoulders with the casual authority of someone who'd done this before, resistance had felt less like strength and more like performance. So she'd gotten in the car. And now she was leaving behind the small life she'd built. The apartment with its view of the Perioli rooftops, the independence she'd fought for, the illusion that she controlled her own story. Lorenzo sat beside her, one arm resting along the back of the seat, close enough that she felt the heat of him but not touching. He hadn't touched her since they'd left her apartment. Hadn't needed to. Where are you taking me? Her voice sounded smaller than she wanted it to. Somewhere safer. His answer was smooth, practiced, revealing nothing. That's not an answer. He turned his head slightly, dark eyes finding hers in the shadows. It's the only one you need right now. Kemi scoffed, a bitter sound that surprised even her. You expect me to trust you? I expect you to survive, Lorenzo corrected, his tone matter-of-fact. Trust is optional. Breathing isn't. The car turned sharply, crossing the Ponte Milvio. Below them, the Tiber River moved through Rome like liquid darkness, ancient and patient, swallowing reflections of street lamps and secrets with equal indifference. The bridge felt symbolic, like crossing from one life into another, from the person she'd been into whoever Lorenzo De Santis was about to make her become. Do you do this with all the women you sleep with? She asked, keeping her voice steady with effort. Catalog their lives and relocate them like chess pieces? Lorenzo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. No. Then what makes me so special? The silence that followed felt weighted, deliberate. You didn't ask for anything, he said finally, his voice quieter than before. Not my name. Not my money. Not my protection. He paused and something flickered across his face, confusion maybe or the memory of it. After Milan I waited for the call. The demands. The threats to go public or the request for compensation. And? You disappeared. He said it like she'd committed a crime. Like that night meant nothing. Like I was forgettable. Despite everything, the fear, the anger, the surreal horror of her situation, Kemi almost laughed. And that impressed you? It confused me. The admission came reluctantly. I don't get confused often. The car slowed, pulling up to wrought iron gates that looked old enough to have protected Renaissance estates. Guards stood on either side, their posture military sharp, weapons barely concealed beneath expensive jackets. Lorenzo's window lowered an inch, just enough for his face to be visible. No words were exchanged. No identification requested. The gates opened immediately, like the city itself was welcoming him home. Kemi's stomach dropped as they drove through, up a long curved driveway lined with cypress trees that stood like dark sentinels. The villa that emerged from the Roman night was stunning. 3 stories of honey-colored stone, tall windows glowing with warm light, balconies overlooking the city below like a king surveying his kingdom. "This is where you keep people safe?" Kemi asked, her throat tight. "Or where you hide them?" Lorenzo's answer was simple and terrifying. Yes. Inside, the villa was a study in restrained power. No gold leaf or Baroque excess, nothing that screamed wealth. Just marble floors worn smooth by centuries, dark wood paneling that caught the light like burnished bronze, furniture that was clearly expensive but chose not to announce it. Everything was elegant, masculine, controlled. Like the man who owned it. A woman approached them, mid-40s, beautiful in that timeless Italian way, dressed in black silk that whispered authority. Her eyes were kind but assessing, cataloging Kemi's disheveled appearance, her protective hand on her stomach, the way she stood too far from Lorenzo. "Sofia," Lorenzo said, switching to Italian. "Assicurati che la signorina Johnson abbia tutto cio di cui ha bisogno." Sofia's gaze softened fractionally as it dropped to Kemi's barely visible pregnancy. "Of course. And no one comes near her." Lorenzo's tone shifted, hardened into something that made even Sofia straighten slightly. "No calls. No visitors. No unexpected guests. No exceptions." Sofia nodded once, crisp and professional. "Understood, capo." Kemi turned on him, anger finally breaking through the shock. "I'm not a prisoner." Lorenzo met her stare with infuriating calm. "Not if you don't act like one." He turned to leave, dismissing her, dismissing the conversation, already moving on to whatever came next in the carefully orchestrated machine of his life. "Wait." The word escaped before Kemi could stop it, sharp and desperate. He paused mid-step, tension visible in the line of his shoulders. "You said I'd be safe here," Kemi continued, forcing herself to meet his eyes even as her heart hammered. "That doesn't mean anything if you don't tell me what I'm being kept safe from." Lorenzo studied her for a long moment, dark eyes weighing how much truth she could handle, how much honesty was strategic versus how much was merciful. "My family has enemies," he said finally, choosing each word with care. "Old ones. Patient ones. The kind who understand that revenge is a dish best served cold, and who've been waiting years for the right moment to serve it." "And this baby?" Kemi's hand moved to her stomach again. "It's a target." "Yes." No hesitation. No cushioning the blow. The honesty hit harder than any lie could have. Lorenzo stepped closer, lowering his voice to something almost intimate. "But it's also leverage. For me. Proof that I'm capable of attachment. Of weakness." She flinched like he'd struck her. "That's supposed to comfort me?" "No," he said. "It's supposed to prepare you for what comes next." And then he left, his footsteps echoing across marble floors, leaving her standing in a beautiful prison with a woman named Sofia and the growing realization that her life would never be simple again. That night, Kemi couldn't sleep. She lay in a bed the size of her entire bedroom back in London, staring at a ceiling painted with faded frescoes, classical scenes of gods and mortals, power and submission. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, the mattress perfectly firm, and she'd never felt more uncomfortable in her life. Outside the tall windows, Rome hummed with its ancient rhythm, distant traffic, a siren cutting through the night, the eternal city breathing the way it had for thousands of years while empires rose and fell and people like her tried desperately to survive them. She pressed both hands to her stomach, feeling the subtle changes already beginning beneath her skin. "I'm trying," she whispered to the tiny cluster of cells that had rewritten her entire future. "I don't know how to do this yet, don't know how to be what you need, but I'm trying." The door opened softly. Kemi sat up instantly, heart lurching, reaching for, what? She had no weapon, no defense, nothing but the naive hope that Lorenzo's promises meant something. Lorenzo stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway's dim lighting. His suit jacket was gone, shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle and a watch that probably cost more than a car. He looked less like the king of Rome now and more like a man who'd been carrying the weight of a crown for too long. "I didn't mean to frighten you." His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. She blinked, thrown off balance by something that might have been an apology. That's new. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, there and gone. You're not wrong to be afraid. He stepped inside, moving to the chair near the window rather than approaching the bed, maintaining distance, offering something that might have been respect. When he sat, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. Tired. Almost vulnerable. You deserve to understand what you're walking into, he said. And what would that be? Kemi pulled the sheet higher, armor of silk and thread count. My world. He said it simply, but the words carried weight. History. Blood. This child will inherit more than my name, Tesoro. They will inherit my enemies. My allies. The debts and the favors and the violence that comes with being a De Santis. Her chest tightened. I don't want your world. I just want my life back. Lorenzo looked at her then, really looked like he was seeing past the fear and anger to the woman underneath. You think I wanted this life? You think I chose it? The question hung between them, unexpected in its rawness. I was born into this, he continued, voice low and edged with something that might have been old resentment. My father's son. My grandfather's heir. I learned to shoot before I learned to read, learned which families to trust and which to destroy before I understood what friendship meant. He paused. This child will have the same education. Whether you like it or not. The room felt heavier, the air thick with implications. And what happens to me? Kemi asked, hating how small her voice sounded. In this future you're planning without asking me? He stood slowly, moving toward her with that predatory grace that should have frightened her more than it did. He stopped at the foot of the bed, close enough to matter but far enough to let her breathe. You stay alive, he said. That's it? That's all you're offering me? For now. His eyes held hers. Until I know what you want beyond survival. She laughed softly, bitterly. You don't even pretend this is about us. About what happened in Milan. Lorenzo stepped closer then, rounding the bed until he stood beside her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Close enough that she could smell cedar and smoke and something darker underneath. Don't mistake restraint for indifference, he said quietly. If I didn't care, you'd still be in that apartment. Unguarded. Unprotected. Easy prey for anyone who figured out what you mean to me. And what do I mean to you? The question escaped before she could stop it. His hand lifted, hovering near her stomach, never touching, always stopping just short. The ghost of contact more intimate than anything physical. You're carrying my blood, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to something that sounded almost like a vow. My future. The first thing in my entire life that feels like it might be worth more than power or territory or revenge. His eyes met hers, dark and endless and terrifyingly honest. I will burn Rome to ash before I let anyone harm what's mine. Kemi's breath caught. Not at the threat, at the promise underneath it. I'm not a possession, she whispered. No. His almost smile returned, sad and knowing. You're something far more dangerous. You're a weakness I can't afford and a future I can't walk away from. He stepped back then, releasing her from the intensity of his presence. Sleep, he said, moving toward the door. Sophia will bring you breakfast in the morning. Anything you need, ask her. This villa is yours now. Except the ability to leave. Lorenzo paused in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the hallway light. Except that. And then he was gone, leaving Kemi alone with frescoed gods and the terrifying understanding that Lorenzo De Santis wasn't protecting her out of obligation or guilt or even honor. He was protecting her because somewhere between Milan and Rome, between one reckless night and a positive pregnancy test, he had made a decision that rewrote both their futures. She belonged to him now. Not as property. Not as conquest. But as something he'd finally found worth defending with everything he had, even if it meant war with the entire city stretched out below them, ancient and ruthless and waiting to see if love could survive in a world built on blood. Kemi knew she had crossed into another world the moment the men stopped pretending she wasn't there. The dining room was all dark wood and old money, the kind of space where empires were negotiated over espresso and lives were ended with a nod. Tall windows overlooked Rome's sprawl, but heavy curtains muted the sunlight to something softer, more secretive. The air smelled of bergamot, polished leather, and something sharper underneath that Kemi couldn't name. Power maybe. Or blood that had been scrubbed clean but never quite forgotten. She stood near the doorway where Sophia had left her with a sympathetic glance and no explanation. Hands clasped so tightly her fingers had gone numb. The weight of scrutiny pressed against her skin like a physical thing. 5 pairs of eyes measuring her worth, calculating her threat, deciding whether she was an asset or a problem to be solved. Lorenzo stood at the head of the long oak table, perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the chair back in front of him. He hadn't sat down yet. Wouldn't, Kemi was beginning to understand, until everyone else in the room acknowledged exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. To his right sat Paolo Ferraro, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, 60 if he was a day, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of difficult decisions. His eyes were sharp and assessing, missing nothing. A man who had survived long enough in this world to know when to speak and when silence was the sharper weapon. Across from him lounged Vittorio Mancini, younger by 20 years, maybe early 40s, all sharp angles and barely restrained aggression wrapped in a Brioni suit. He sat back in his chair like a coiled spring, arms crossed over his chest, dark eyes flicking repeatedly to Kemi's stomach with an expression that made her skin crawl. Beside Vittorio sat Riccardo Greco, Lorenzo's shadow, his most trusted lieutenant. Mid-30s, quiet in the way predators were quiet before they struck. He'd been the one to open her car door when they'd arrived, the one whose eyes tracked every entrance and exit like a man who'd learned the hard way that survival meant constant vigilance. He said nothing now. Didn't need to. And at the far end of the table, almost forgotten in the shadows, sat Marco Bellini, the accountant, the numbers man, the one who made blood money look legitimate on paper. He kept his eyes down, fingers drumming nervously against a leather portfolio, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. This is unnecessary. Vittorio broke the silence first, his voice carrying the arrogant edge of someone who thought himself indispensable. We don't involve outsiders in family business. Lorenzo didn't look at him. His gaze remained fixed on some point beyond the windows, on Rome stretched below them like a kingdom waiting to be claimed or defended. She's not an outsider, he said, his voice calm and absolute. The air in the room shifted, tightened. She's carrying my child. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. Paolo's eyebrows lifted fractionally, not surprise, Kemi realized, but calculation. Riccardo's attention sharpened, his entire posture changing from watchful to protective. Marco's fingers stopped drumming. And Vittorio's expression twisted into something ugly. Your child? Vittorio repeated slowly, tasting the words like spoiled wine. Or a liability disguised as legacy? Kemi's heart slammed against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay still, to not react, to not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Lorenzo turned then, the movement slow and deliberate, every eye in the room tracking him like prey tracking a predator. He placed both palms flat on the table, leaning forward just slightly. The sound of skin on wood echoed through the room like a warning shot. Say that again, Lorenzo said quietly. Too quietly. I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Vittorio had the sense to hesitate, but pride, or stupidity, pushed him forward. You know what happens when bloodlines complicate things? When sentiment clouds judgment. Weakness invites. Weakness. Lorenzo cut him off, his voice dropping to something dangerous and soft. Is confusing cruelty with strength. Is mistaking paranoia for wisdom. He straightened, and somehow that made him more intimidating, not less. Is thinking you can question my decisions in my home and walk out of this room with your position intact. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vittorio paled slightly but held his ground. I'm only thinking of the family. Riccardo raised one hand, a simple gesture that somehow carried more authority than shouting. Enough. Silence crashed down instantly, absolute and suffocating. Paolo leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin, the pose of a man who'd sat in too many rooms like this and knew how to read the currents. The child changes things, he said carefully, diplomatically. Our enemies will sense it. Weakness, opportunity, whatever they want to call it. They already have, Lorenzo replied, some of the ice leaving his voice. That's why she's here. That's why this conversation is happening. He glanced at Kemi, and for a moment something almost soft flickered across his face. Protection isn't weakness, Paolo. It's insurance. Paolo's gaze shifted to Kemi, assessing but not unkind. Capisci cosa significa questo, ragazza? Do you understand what this means? Kemi swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes. That I don't have a choice anymore. A faint smile tugged at Paolo's weathered mouth, something that might have been approval or sympathy, she couldn't tell which. Smart girl. Lorenzo straightened, his voice taking on the tone of command that clearly ended discussions. She stays under my direct protection. No one speaks of her outside this room. No one approaches her without my knowledge. Anyone who disobeys, he let the pause stretch, let the implication settle, answers to me personally. Vittorio scoffed, a bitter sound. You're letting sentiment cloud your... I'm letting legacy guide me. Lorenzo's gaze snapped to him with the force of a physical blow. This child is a De Santis, the first of a new generation. That makes them sacred, capito? And anyone who threatens them threatens me. The finality in his voice left no room for argument. The meeting fractured after that. Orders were given in clipped Italian too rapid for Kemi to follow. Phones buzzed with encrypted messages. Men stood, straightening expensive suits, exchanging glances weighted with meaning she couldn't decode. As they filed toward the door, Vittorio paused beside Kemi, close enough that she caught the scent of his cologne, something sharp and medicinal that made her stomach turn. His smile was thin, sharp, meant to cut. Attenta cara, he murmured, switching to Italian like the language itself was a weapon she couldn't defend against. Women who carry kings rarely survive the crown. Lorenzo was at his side before Kemi could draw breath, moving with the fluid speed of violence barely leashed. Vatine. The single word carried enough threat to fill the room. Vittorio met his gaze for a long moment. A test, a challenge, or maybe just the death wish of a man who'd forgotten what real power looked like. Then survival instinct kicked in and he stepped back, nodded once and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than slamming. When the last footsteps faded down the hallway, Kemi released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking. Her knees felt weak. She wanted to sit down, to cry, to scream at the unfairness of being dissected by strangers who held her future in their blood-stained hands. So that's your family, she said softly, hating how her voice wavered. They hate me. They fear what you represent. Lorenzo turned to face her fully, and exhaustion showed in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. That's worse than hate. Hate can be managed. Fear makes people desperate. She looked at him, really looked past the armor of expensive suits and controlled violence to the man underneath. And what do I represent to them? He studied her for a long moment, dark eyes searching hers for something she couldn't name. Change, he said finally. The end of one era and the beginning of something they can't control. Something I can't control. A pause heavy with implication. That terrifies them more than any rival family ever could. Later that night, Kemi found herself on the villa's terrace, drawn by the need for space and air and something that felt less like captivity. Rome stretched endlessly below, a tapestry of amber streetlights and ancient architecture, domes rising like prayers against the darkening sky, the Tiber winding through it all like a vein carrying the city's lifeblood. It was breathtaking, overwhelming. A reminder that she was just one small life in a city that had swallowed millions of stories and would continue long after hers was forgotten. You shouldn't be alone out here. Lorenzo's voice came from behind her, quiet but unmistakable. I needed air. She didn't turn around. Needed to remember there's a world outside these walls. He moved beside her, close enough that she felt his presence like heat, but not touching. His hands came to rest on the stone balustrade, and for a moment they stood in silence. Two people bound by biology and circumstance trying to figure out what that meant. You didn't tell them everything, Kemi said finally. No. About the baby. About Milan. About us. No. She turned to face him, searching his profile in the fading light. What? I thought honesty was supposed to be your currency in this world. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath tan skin. Because once they know how much something matters to me, truly matters not just strategically, they'll look for ways to use it. Vittorio's already circling. Others will follow. Her chest tightened with something between fear and an emotion she refused to name. And you? I eliminate threats before they materialize. He said it simply, like discussing the weather. Like murder was just another item on his to-do list. The ease of it made her shiver. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm Roman night. You talk about this child like they're already yours. Like I'm just the vessel delivering your air. They are mine. He turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze stole her breath. But you, he stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that didn't come easily, you are the mother of my heir. That's not an answer, Kemi said quietly. That's a title. A function. Lorenzo exhaled slowly, and for the first time she saw something crack in his controlled facade. You are inconvenient. She laughed, a sound caught between bitterness and genuine amusement. Well, at least you're honest. And dangerous, he continued, his voice dropping lower. Because you make me hesitate. Make me consider consequences I've spent my entire life learning to ignore. His eyes held hers. I don't hesitate, Kemi. Hesitation is how men like me end up dead. But with you. He stopped, the sentence hanging unfinished between them like a confession he couldn't quite make. Silence stretched, filled with the distant sounds of Rome, car horns, laughter from some distant party, the eternal hum of a city that never truly slept. Then, so gently it felt like a question rather than a claim, Lorenzo reached out and brushed his knuckles against the back of her hand where it rested on the stone. Not grasping. Not demanding. Just connecting. The touch was feather-light, almost hesitant. Nothing like the man who'd invaded her apartment or commanded a room full of killers. This was something else. Something almost vulnerable. Kemi didn't pull away. She should have. Every survival instinct screamed at her to maintain distance, to not let him see how his touch made her pulse race, how some traitorous part of her leaned into the warmth of him despite everything. But she didn't move. This doesn't change anything, she whispered, even as her fingers curved slightly toward his. No, Lorenzo agreed. It changes everything. Somewhere in the city below, a church bell tolled, deep and resonant, marking time the way it had for centuries. Ancient. Warning. Inevitable. Because Kemi Johnson had just stepped fully into a world where men bowed or bled, where cities could burn on a single word, and where love, if it came at all, would arrive wrapped in fire and violence and the terrible understanding that some bonds couldn't be broken no matter how desperately you wanted to run. She was no longer just pregnant and afraid. She was Lorenzo De Santis's future. And in Rome, that made her either a queen in waiting or a target painted in gold. The only question was which crown would kill her first. Kemi woke to silence so complete it felt wrong. For a moment, she lay perfectly still in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling where dawn light painted pale gold across centuries-old plasterwork. She listened, counting heartbeats, waiting for proof that the world beyond these walls still existed. Then she heard it, the low thrum of generators, distant footsteps on marble, the muted cadence of men speaking Italian somewhere below. She was not alone. She would never be alone again. The realization settled over her like a weight as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing at the dull ache that had taken up residence in her lower back. The pregnancy was still early, still fragile, but her body was already changing. Slower mornings, sharper hunger, a strange awareness of every sensation as if her nerves had been dialed up to protect the life growing inside her. When she stepped into the hallway, 2 guards straightened immediately from their positions flanking her door. Young men, maybe late 20s, with the kind of watchful stillness that came from military training or something darker. "Buongiorno, signorina," one said politely, inclining his head. "Mr. De Santis requested that you not leave the upper floor without an escort." Kemi folded her arms, exhaustion making her sharper than wise. How convenient. Prison with better decor. The guard's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Sympathy, maybe, or recognition of a truth he couldn't acknowledge. "Breakfast is ready whenever you're prepared." She didn't argue. Arguing required leverage and she had none. So she followed them down the sweeping staircase, past oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who'd probably made similar impossible choices, into a villa that hummed with controlled motion. Downstairs felt like a command center disguised as luxury. Staff moved with quiet efficiency, a woman arranging fresh flowers, another setting out silver coffee service, a third speaking rapid Italian into a phone tucked against her shoulder. Guards checked their phones, exchanged glances weighted with meaning, adjusted weapons hidden beneath expensive suits. The smell of espresso hung thick and rich in the air, mixing with something else. Tension, maybe, or the metallic anticipation that came before violence. Lorenzo stood near the kitchen island, speaking in low, urgent Italian to Riccardo. Both men were already dressed for the day, Lorenzo in charcoal gray that made him look like a prince from some darker fairy tale, Riccardo in black that made him look like exactly what he was. Lorenzo's head lifted the instant Kemi entered, as if he'd been tracking her approach through walls and floors. "You're awake," he said, dismissing Riccardo with a subtle nod that sent the other man melting toward the exit. She approached slowly, hyper-aware of eyes on her, staff pretending not to watch, guards cataloging her every movement. "Is something wrong?" Lorenzo studied her for a beat too long, his dark eyes searching her face like he was looking for cracks in a foundation. "You tell me." She hesitated, one hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. "I don't feel safe." His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath tan skin. "You are," he said, and it sounded like both a promise and a command to the universe itself. "That's not what I asked." He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand along his jaw in a gesture that made him look suddenly, unexpectedly human. "Tired. There was an incident last night." Kemi's stomach dropped. What kind of incident? A car followed one of my men from Trastevere. Black Audi, no plates, professional surveillance. He said it calmly, clinically, like discussing the weather. They stayed 3 cars back, changed positions twice, then disappeared near the Vatican. Her pulse spiked, fear flooding cold through her veins. They followed him here? They tried. We lost them in traffic near Piazza Navona. His eyes held hers. They didn't get close. But they were watching. They know about me. Not a question. A terrible certainty. They suspect, Lorenzo corrected, but the distinction felt meaningless. That's not the same thing. Kemi shook her head, bitter laughter threatening to escape. You said no one would touch me. You promised I'd be safe here. And no one has touched you. His voice hardened. You're standing here, breathing, unharmed. That's what safe looks like in my world. Yet, she shot back. No one has touched me yet. The word hung between them like a prophecy neither wanted to acknowledge. Lorenzo stepped closer, lowering his voice to something that felt almost intimate despite the staff bustling around them. This is exactly why I brought you here. Why I can't let you out of my sight. One moment of carelessness, one gap in security, and this becomes my life forever? She cut him off, anger finally breaking through the fear. Looking over my shoulder? Waiting for violence? Raising a child who learns to count exits before they learn to count to 10. Silence crashed down between them. For the first time since she'd met him, Lorenzo looked genuinely unsettled. The control that he wore like armor showed hairline fractures. You think I enjoy this? He asked quietly, each word carefully measured. Dragging you into a war you didn't choose? Making you a target just by association? Kemi met his gaze, refusing to let him off the hook with pretty words and tactical justifications. I think you don't know how to let go. I think holding on is the only thing you know how to do, even when it's destroying what you're trying to protect. The words landed harder than she'd intended, cutting through his defenses to something raw underneath. Lorenzo's eyes darkened, not with anger but with something deeper and more dangerous. Recognition maybe. Or the pain of truth he'd spent years avoiding. I don't let go, he said finally, his voice rough. People who let go in my world don't survive. They get buried. Forgotten. Erased. She softened despite herself, despite every reason not to. And what happens when you hold on so tight you crush what you're trying to save? He didn't answer. Couldn't maybe. That afternoon, Kemi insisted on walking outside. Lorenzo resisted at first, his face going through that familiar calculation of risk versus reward, control versus concession. Then he relented with visible reluctance, immediately assigning twice the usual security detail. 4 guards instead of 2, weapons more visible, radios crackling with constant updates. They walked the villa's grounds beneath a pale Roman sun that felt tentative, as if even the weather knew something was coming. Cypress trees cast long shadows over gravel paths. Stone fountains burbled with water that had flowed for centuries. It should have been peaceful. It felt like walking through a beautiful trap. This feels like a gilded cage, Kemi said, watching a guard circle the perimeter for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. It's temporary, Lorenzo replied, but the assurance rang hollow. She stopped walking, turning to face him on the path. Is it? Really? Or is this just what my life becomes now? Beautiful prisons and armed guards and waiting for the next attack. He turned slowly, something shifting in his expression. What do you want me to say? I want the truth. She lifted her chin. You talk about legacy like it's destiny. About bloodlines and empires and protecting what's yours. But you never ask what I want. What kind of life I imagine for my child. His gaze sharpened, focused on her with that unsettling intensity. What do you want? She hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. I want my child to grow up without fear. Without looking over their shoulder. Without learning that love and violence are the same language. That's exactly what I'm offering, Lorenzo said. Protection. Power. A name that means something. No. Kemi shook her head. You're offering power. Control. The ability to hurt people before they hurt us. Those aren't the same as safety, Lorenzo. They're just different kinds of war. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. Before he could respond, a sound split the afternoon air. Sharp. Distant. Unmistakable. Gunfire. The world exploded into chaos. Lorenzo moved with inhuman speed, grabbing Kemi and pulling her down behind a stone retaining wall as guards shouted and weapons appeared from holsters like magic tricks. Her heart slammed violently against her ribs, so hard she thought it might crack bone. The ground was cold and rough beneath her knees and all she could think was the baby, protect the baby, don't let anything happen. Stay down, Lorenzo ordered, his body covering hers, one arm wrapped around her shoulders in a grip that was both protective and imprisoning. Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't do anything. She clutched her stomach with both hands, terror flooding her system with adrenaline that made everything too bright, too loud, too real. The shots came again, closer this time, the crack of rifles echoing off stone walls. Lorenzo's calm shattered like glass. "Ricardo," he barked, his voice carrying across the grounds with command that decades of breeding couldn't teach. "South perimeter, adesso." Flanked them from the garden side. Men moved with brutal efficiency born of practice and survival. The sounds of boots on gravel, shouted coordinates in Italian, returned fire that made Kemi's ears ring. The world had become violence and noise, and the terrible understanding that this was real, this was happening, someone was trying to kill them. Kemi pressed her forehead to the cold stone, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. She could taste copper. Had she bitten her tongue? Or was fear just that metallic? Then she felt it. Lorenzo's hand, steady and warm on her back. Not grabbing. Not controlling. Just there. "I've got you," he said, and his voice had changed from commander to something else entirely. Something raw and fierce and personal. "Tiho presa. I won't let anything happen to you. I swear it on my blood, on my name, on everything I am, nothing touches you." The words felt different this time. Not strategic positioning. Not tactical advantage. Personal. Minutes stretched like hours, each second measured in heartbeats and prayers to gods Kemi wasn't sure she believed in. The gunfire became sporadic, then stopped entirely. Sirens wailed in the distance. Police or ambulance, the soundtrack of violence in any language. Ricardo appeared from around the corner, breathing hard, a smear of something dark on his cheek that might have been dirt or might have been blood. "It was a probe," he reported, switching to English for Kemi's benefit or maybe just from habit. "3 shooters, professional tactics. They retreated when we returned fire. No casualties on our side." Lorenzo stood slowly, his body still positioned between Kemi and any potential threat, scanning the perimeter with eyes that had gone cold and calculating. "Vittorio?" Ricardo hesitated, and that pause said more than words. "We can't be certain. But the timing, the tactics, it has his signature." Lorenzo's jaw clenched so hard Kemi heard his teeth grind. He turned to her, offering his hand. "You're leaving Rome." Her eyes widened as she let him pull her to her feet. "What?" "Tonight. I have a property in Tuscany, another in Sicily. You'll be safer." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "I'm not running. This isn't a debate, Kemi." "You're right." She pulled her hand from his, standing on shaking legs but standing nonetheless. "It's not. Because you don't get to decide everything. You don't get to dictate my entire life just because you're scared." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe that she'd named what he wouldn't admit. "I'm not." "You are," she interrupted. "I can see it. You're terrified. And when you're terrified you grab tighter. Control harder. Lock everything down until you can't breathe." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "But I'm not one of your assets, Lorenzo. I'm not territory to defend or a weapon to hide. I'm a person. And if we're doing this, if I'm really staying in your world, then we do it as partners or we don't do it at all." For a moment it looked like he might argue. The commander rising up to issue orders that would be followed because that's what always happened. Then, something unexpected. Lorenzo exhaled and the armor cracked wider. "Fine," he said quietly, the single word costing him more than she'd ever know. "Then we do this together." She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "I underestimated them," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice was almost painful to hear. "And I underestimated you. I've been treating you like something fragile that needs to be locked away for safekeeping." His eyes met hers. "That won't happen again." The confession stunned her into silence. Later that night, as Kemi lay awake listening to the villa settle around her, creaking wood, distant footsteps, the sound of guards changing shifts, Lorenzo appeared at her door. He didn't knock. Didn't announce himself. Just materialized in the doorway like a shadow taking human form, still dressed but disheveled, tie gone, shirt unbuttoned at the collar. "I'm not good at this," he said without preamble. Kemi sat up, pulling the sheet higher. "At what?" "Caring." The word seemed to cost him something. "It's a liability in my world. Weakness. The kind of thing that gets you killed or worse, gets the people you care about killed." She studied him in the dim light filtering through the windows. Then why do it? Lorenzo stepped into the room but stopped halfway, maintaining distance like he didn't trust himself to come closer. Because when those shots rang out today, when I heard them getting closer and all I could think was that they might hit you, his voice roughened. I didn't think about Rome, or legacy, or what the family would say, or even what losing an heir would mean strategically. Her breath caught. I thought about you. The confession landed between them like something fragile and dangerous. Just you. Bleeding. Dying. Gone. And the idea of that, of a world where you didn't exist anymore. He stopped, jaw working like he was fighting words that wanted to escape. It terrified me, he finished quietly. Kemi didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to process this crack in his armor, this glimpse of the man beneath the monster everyone feared. Lorenzo moved closer then, but stopped at the foot of her bed, hands curling into fists at his sides. I don't promise safety, he said. I can't. Not honestly. But I promise vengeance. I promise that anyone who hurts you will beg for death long before I grant it. I promise that our child will be protected by fear so absolute that even thinking about harming them will feel like suicide. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes catching the moonlight. And I promise, he said, voice dropping to something almost tender, that I will try, God help me, I will try, to be something other than what this world made me. For you. For them. Kemi met his gaze, fear and something else twisting together in her chest. Something that felt dangerously like hope or trust, or the beginning of something she wasn't ready to name. For the first time she saw it clearly. The most dangerous thing about Lorenzo De Santis wasn't his power or his violence or his ability to command armies with a word. It was the moment he started to feel. The moment his armor cracked and the man underneath bled through. And somewhere in the shadows of Rome, in back rooms and expensive restaurants, in phone calls encrypted and plans years in the making, someone had just decided that crack was the perfect place to drive a knife. The war for Kemi Johnson's future had begun. And the first casualty would be anyone foolish enough to think Lorenzo De Santis would lose without burning the entire city to ash. Rome woke slowly the morning after the gunfire, stretching and yawning in golden light, utterly unaware that invisible lines had been crossed in the darkness. Kemi stood by the tall window of her room, forehead pressed against cool glass, watching sunrise spill like honey over terracotta rooftops that had witnessed emperors and assassinations, revolutions and renaissance, the rise and fall of dynasties built on blood and ambition. The city looked peaceful, deceptively, dangerously peaceful, for a place where someone had tried to murder her less than 12 hours ago. She rested both hands on her stomach, breathing carefully through the anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. Her body still trembled when she let herself remember the crack of gunfire, the way Lorenzo had moved without hesitation to cover her, the iron certainty in his voice when he'd sworn nothing would touch her. She didn't want to admit how much that promise had mattered. How much she'd believed it. A soft knock interrupted the spiral of her thoughts. Come in, she called, stepping back from the window. Sophia entered quietly, carrying a silver tray laden with espresso, fresh fruit, pastries that smelled like butter and hope. Mr. De Santis asked me to bring you breakfast. He said, she hesitated, choosing her words with care, that you need to keep your strength up. Kemi managed a weak smile. Is he all right? Sophia paused just long enough for the answer to be clear before she spoke. He hasn't slept. He's been in the study since before dawn making calls. Her eyes softened with something like sympathy. Men like him don't rest when their world is threatened. After Sophia left, Kemi sat with the tray untouched, staring at food her stomach couldn't handle. Eventually discipline won over nausea. The baby needed nutrients, needed her to be stronger than her fear. So she ate mechanically, tasting nothing, fueling herself like a machine that had to keep running. When she finished, restless energy drove her from the room. She couldn't sit still, couldn't pretend everything was normal, couldn't hide while Lorenzo planned whatever terrible thing came next. She needed answers. She found him in the study. The room smelled of old leather, expensive tobacco and something sharper. Tension maybe, or the metallic scent that preceded violence. Maps were spread across the mahogany desk like battle plans, marked with red ink and handwritten notes in Italian she couldn't decipher. Lorenzo stood with his back to the door, jacket discarded, white shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands braced on the table like Atlas holding up the sky. You're planning something, Kemi said from the doorway. He didn't turn, didn't startle. Had probably known she was there before she'd even knocked. I'm responding. To what? She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. To betrayal. The word came out flat, final, like a death sentence already passed. That made her stomach drop, ice water flooding her veins. He finally turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Not anger, though that was there too, but something colder. Calculation. The predator deciding exactly how its prey would die. Vittorio Mancini has been moving without authorization, Lorenzo said. Making calls. Meeting with rivals. Positioning himself. Kemi's pulse quickened, fear and terrible understanding warring in her chest. You think he was behind the shooting? I know he was. No doubt. No hesitation. How can you be sure? Lorenzo reached into a drawer and pulled out a phone. Not his usual one, something older, a burner probably. He slid it across the desk toward her like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. On the screen was a message thread. Short. Coded. Unmistakable once you understood what you were looking at. South Garden. 15:30, 3 men. No witnesses. Confirmed. Payment on completion. Make it look like rivals. Not us. All sent from a number labeled simply, VM. Kemi stared at the messages until the words blurred, her hands going cold and numb. He tried to kill us. He tried to kill you, Lorenzo corrected, his voice precise and deadly. Killing me would be too obvious, too risky. But removing you? Making it look like rival families capitalizing on a perceived weakness. He leaned back against the desk. That's surgical. Strategic. Exactly Vittorio's style. Her throat tightened until breathing hurt. What? What did I do to him? You existed. Lorenzo's expression didn't change. You represent change. A shift in priorities. The possibility that I might choose something, someone, over the family's interests. His eyes held hers. To men like Vittorio, that's unforgivable. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm Roman morning. And what do you do with people who betray you? Lorenzo's expression didn't flicker. Didn't soften. I erased them. The finality of it, the casual certainty like discussing which wine to serve with dinner, sent a shiver racing down her spine. You're going to kill him, Kemi said. Not a question. A terrible statement of fact. Yes. She took a shaky breath. Because of me? No. His voice sharpened, cutting. Because of him. Because he broke faith. Because he threatened what's mine and expected to walk away breathing. He pushed off the desk, moving toward her with controlled intensity. Don't take that burden, Kemi. This is ancient math. Blood for blood. Betrayal for death. It existed long before you and will exist long after. She stepped closer despite every instinct screaming at her to retreat. You don't have to do this. There are other ways, exile, negotiation, some kind of... There aren't. He cut her off, not unkindly. Not in my world. Show mercy to a traitor and you might as well paint a target on your own back and hand out bullets. Their eyes locked across the narrow space. You think this makes me safer, Kemi said quietly. But it just proves your world will never stop coming for us. That there will always be another Vittorio, another threat, another reason to spill blood. Then I make sure they're too afraid to try. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. I make an example so horrifying that even thinking about touching you feels like suicide. Kemi shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. And what happens when our child asks what kind of man their father is? When they're old enough to understand where the money comes from, why people fear your name, what you've done to keep them safe? The question hit him like a physical blow. She saw it land, saw something crack in his careful control. Lorenzo looked away, jaw working. What do I tell them? Kemi pressed, voice breaking. That you're a good man who does terrible things? That the blood on your hands washes off as long as it was spilled for the right reasons? I don't have an answer, he said roughly. Then find one. She moved closer, close enough to feel the heat of him, the coiled violence barely leashed. Because I don't want them to fear you, Lorenzo. I don't want them to grow up thinking love and violence are the same language. I want them to know their father chose something better. Silence filled the study, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Lorenzo spoke, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. I was 12 years old when I watched my uncle die for showing mercy. Kemi froze, shock stealing her breath. Carlo Benedetti owed my family money, Lorenzo continued, staring at something only he could see. A lot of money. But his daughter was sick, cancer I think. He begged my father for more time, for compassion. My uncle argued that we should wait, that honor meant more than immediate payment. His hands curled into fists. My father said compassion was a luxury we couldn't afford. That in our world, mercy looks like weakness and weakness gets you killed. Lorenzo. 3 days later, my uncle was found in the Tiber. His voice stayed flat, emotionless, but she heard the pain underneath. Shot twice in the head. Professional. A message. My father explained that Uncle Carlo had been right about honor but wrong about survival. That I needed to learn the difference. He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there broke something in her chest. I learned, he said simply. I learned that in this world you protect what's yours or you bury it. There's no third option. Kemi's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Until me. Until you, he echoed, something raw and honest in his voice. You're the first thing in my life that makes me question everything I was taught. That makes me wonder if my father was wrong. If there might be another way. He stepped closer, lifting one hand like he might touch her face, then stopping just short. Always stopping short. But I can't afford to wonder right now, he said. Not with Vittorio out there, already moving, already planning the next attempt. You don't understand what you're asking of me. If I hesitate, if I show weakness, I lose everything. The baby. My position. My life. And if you don't hesitate, Kemi whispered, you lose yourself. You become exactly what your father made you, and our child inherits that legacy. The words hung between them like smoke, impossible to take back. A sharp knock broke the moment. Riccardo entered without waiting for permission, his expression grave. Boss. It's confirmed. Mancini left the city 2 hours ago. Lorenzo's entire posture changed, shifted into something harder. More dangerous. Dove. Where? South. Naples most likely. He has cousins there, connections in the Camorra. Riccardo's eyes flicked briefly to Kemi, something like apology in them. He's moving fast. Lorenzo nodded once, decisive. Prepare the car. Full detail. We leave in 20 minutes. Riccardo hesitated, which was unusual enough to be noteworthy. And the woman? Lorenzo didn't look away from Kemi when he answered. She stays here. Protected. No exceptions. No, Kemi said immediately, the word sharp and certain. Both men turned to her like she'd spoken in tongues. I'm not staying behind while you go to war, she continued, forcing her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. I'm not sitting in this villa waiting for news that you're dead. This isn't a discussion, Lorenzo said, his tone shifting to command, the voice that moved armies and ended arguments. You're right. It's not. She lifted her chin, channeling every ounce of strength her mother had taught her, every lesson in standing your ground even when the world wanted you small and silent. You don't get to lock me away every time things get dangerous. You don't get to make decisions about my life without me. It's my job to protect you. And it's mine to protect this child, she shot back. Which includes knowing what kind of world you're building. What kind of man you're becoming. I need to see it, Lorenzo. All of it. Not the sanitized version you think I can handle. Lorenzo stared at her, anger and something else warring in his dark eyes. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of it. The realization that she wasn't going to be the compliant, terrified woman he could tuck away and forget about. Finally, he exhaled and she knew she'd won something. Maybe not everything, but something. You stay here, he said, voice tight. But under Riccardo's personal protection. Triple guard detail. No exceptions. If anything feels wrong, you lock yourself in the panic room Sofia showed you. She nodded. Fair. He turned to Riccardo and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. If anything happens to her while I'm gone, if she gets so much as a scratch, if she feels unsafe for even a moment. I answer to you, Riccardo finished, understanding perfectly. With my life. Exactly. That night, the villa felt heavier than ever, like the stones themselves were holding their breath. Kemi lay awake in the too large bed, listening to the sound of engines leaving the grounds, expensive cars carrying dangerous men toward violence she couldn't stop. She knew Lorenzo was out there somewhere in the Italian darkness, planning retribution in her name, preparing to kill a man because that man had dared to threaten her. She hated that part of herself that understood it. Hated more the smaller, darker part that felt something almost like gratitude. Sometime after midnight, when sleep seemed impossible and the shadows felt too close, her door opened quietly. Lorenzo stood there, backlit by the hallway's dim lighting. He changed into darker clothes, black on black, tactical and terrible. A gun was holstered at his side, probably not the only weapon he carried. He looked like exactly what he was, a man about to do violence with professional efficiency. I need to hear you say it, he said softly, not moving from the doorway. Kemi sat up slowly, pulling the sheet higher. Say what? That you understand. His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before, vulnerability maybe, or the need for absolution he'd never ask for directly. That this isn't choice. It's necessity. She studied his face in the darkness, seeing the boy who'd watched his uncle die, the man who'd learned to kill before he'd learned to love, the father-to-be trying desperately to protect what he'd never expected to want. I understand, she said finally. But I don't accept it. I understand the rules of your world, the math of blood for blood. But I don't accept that it has to be this way forever. That our child has to inherit this same impossible choice. He nodded slowly, like that was the answer he'd expected. Maybe even the one he'd needed. That may be the only difference between us that matters. He turned to leave, his hand already on the door. Lorenzo, Kemi called, the name escaping before she could think better of it. He paused, waiting. Come back, she whispered. Please. Whatever you do out there, whoever you become, come back. He looked at her then over his shoulder, not as a mafia boss, not as the king of Rome's underworld, but as a man standing at the edge of something he could never undo. A man who'd found something worth protecting and didn't know if he was strong enough to do it without becoming the monster everyone feared. I always do, he said. But as the door closed behind him and his footsteps faded down the hallway, Kemi pressed both hands to her stomach and let the tears come, silent, hot, unstoppable. Because deep down, in the part of her that had learned to read truth beneath pretty lies, she knew. Blood had been spilled because of her. And once blood entered the story, once that first drop stained the pages, there was no going back to the life she'd imagined. No rewriting the ending into something clean and simple. She was part of Lorenzo's world now. And his world was written in red ink that never, ever faded. Kemi woke to the sound of raised voices cutting through the villa's careful quiet like broken glass scraped across marble. Not shouting, Lorenzo's world was too controlled for that, but sharp, urgent Italian spoken in the clipped tones that preceded violence or disaster. Her heart lurched into her throat before consciousness had fully returned, instinct screaming that something had gone terribly wrong. She sat up in the pre-dawn darkness, one hand instinctively pressing to her stomach where new life grew, oblivious to the chaos erupting around it. Something was wrong. She slipped from the too-large bed, feet hitting cold marble, and moved to the door just as footsteps thundered down the hallway, running, which never happened in Lorenzo's meticulously controlled domain. Riccardo appeared in her doorway, breathless, his usually impassive expression fractured into something close to panic. Get dressed, he said without preamble, already turning to bark orders in Italian at the guards materializing behind him. Now. Quickly. Fear surged through her veins, ice-cold and paralyzing. What happened? Naples. The single word carried the weight of catastrophe. Lorenzo. Her chest constricted, lungs forgetting how to pull air. Is he alive? Riccardo cut her off, and she saw him force the reassurance past whatever truth he was holding back. He's alive. But things didn't go as planned. That was all she needed to hear, and everything she'd feared. Minutes later, Kemi found herself ushered downstairs into the main sitting room, dressed in yesterday's clothes because her hands had shaken too badly to manage buttons or zippers. The villa buzzed with a tension that felt fundamentally different from before. Less controlled, more volatile, like a bomb whose timer had started counting down and no one knew how many seconds remained. Men stood in tight clusters, speaking in voices pitched too low to overhear. Phones rang and were silenced with vicious efficiency. Weapons were checked, loaded, holstered with practiced hands that had done this dance before. The air smelled of gun oil and expensive cologne and something sharper underneath, adrenaline maybe, or the metallic scent that preceded bloodshed. Sophia appeared at her elbow, pale but composed in the way only years of service to dangerous men could teach. Sit, she urged gently, guiding Kemi to the leather sofa. Please. You need to stay calm. For the baby. Kemi barely heard her. All she could think about was Lorenzo, walking into a trap because of her, because she existed and Vittorio had decided she was the crack in his armor worth exploiting. About the blood she knew would follow him wherever he went, staining his hands and his soul and eventually, inevitably, their child's future. Time stretched unbearably, each minute an eternity. Then the front doors crashed open. Lorenzo was supported between two men, his expensive coat darkened at the shoulder with blood that looked black in the dim light. His face was pale, jaw clenched against pain, but his eyes, God, his eyes were still sharp, still scanning for threats even as his body struggled to stay upright. Kemi was on her feet before conscious thought, the world narrowing to just him. Lorenzo. His head snapped up at her voice, eyes finding hers with laser focus. Despite the pain clearly etched into every line of his face, Something softened when he saw her. Relief so profound it looked almost like gratitude. "I told you to stay upstairs," he muttered, but there was no heat in it. Just exhaustion. "You're bleeding." Her voice came out strangled, panic rising like floodwater. "Not mine." He winced as Ricardo helped lower him into a chair. "Most of it anyway." That didn't help. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Medical supplies appearing, orders shouted, the doctor who lived 10 minutes away already en route. Ricardo crouched beside Lorenzo, carefully cutting away the coat and shirt to reveal a long, angry gash across his shoulder, deep enough to need stitches but not life-threatening. Mancini escaped, Ricardo reported quietly, his hands steady as he applied pressure to slow the bleeding. "But we dismantled half his operation. The Naples connection is dead. His cousins won't shelter him again." Lorenzo nodded once, the movement costing him. "Good. That buys us time." Kemi dropped to her knees in front of him without thinking, her hands hovering uselessly because she didn't know how to help, didn't know how to fix bullet wounds and knife cuts and the violence that had become their daily reality. "You could have died," she whispered, and her voice broke on the last word. His gaze locked on hers, dark and intense despite the blood loss. "I didn't. That's not the point." Tears burned behind her eyes, hot and shameful. "This isn't just strategy anymore. This isn't chess pieces and calculated risks. This is your life, Lorenzo. Your blood. And if you die..." She couldn't finish. Couldn't voice the terrible understanding that had crystallized in the hours of waiting, that somewhere between Milan and Rome, between threats and protection, she'd started caring about him as more than just the father of her child. "No," he said quietly, reaching out with his good hand to catch her fingers. "It isn't just strategy. Not anymore." The room gradually emptied as men filtered out, giving them the illusion of privacy. When they were finally alone except for Sophia hovering anxiously in the doorway, Kemi stood abruptly and turned away, wrapping her arms around herself as her emotions threatened to spill over in ways she couldn't afford. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking apart. "I can't sit here in this beautiful prison waiting to see if the man carrying my future comes back alive. I can't lie awake wondering if this is the night someone finally lands the killing shot." Lorenzo rose slowly despite Ricardo's earlier protest that he should stay still, moving toward her with the careful precision of someone working through pain. He stopped just behind her, close enough that she felt his presence like heat. "You think I don't know that?" he said quietly. "Every decision I make now has weight I never had to consider before. Every risk affects you. The baby. A future I didn't know I wanted until it was already here." "Then stop pretending I'm just something you protect," she snapped, whirling to face him. "Stop treating me like a fragile thing that needs to be locked away and guarded. I'm part of this, Lorenzo. Whether you like it or not, whether it was planned or not, I'm in this war with you." He hesitated, and that pause felt monumental. That was new. Lorenzo De Santis didn't hesitate. "You don't get to decide everything anymore," Kemi continued, pressing her advantage. "Not when your choices affect my body. My child. Our future. If I'm staying, if I'm really doing this with you, then I need the truth. All of it. Not the sanitized version you think I can handle." Silence filled the room, heavy with implications. Finally, Lorenzo nodded, something shifting in his expression. "Resignation maybe. Or the beginning of trust." "Sit," he said, gesturing to the sofa. They sat together, close but not touching, the space between them charged with everything unspoken. "Mancini has been undermining me for months," Lorenzo began, his voice steady despite the pain he had to be feeling. "Small things at first. Questioning my decisions in meetings, spreading doubts about my judgment, positioning himself as the more traditional choice. He's been waiting for a weakness, a crack in the foundation he could exploit." "And I'm the crack," Kemi said bitterly. "You're the catalyst," he corrected. "The visible proof that I'm capable of attachment. Of choosing something beyond the family's interests." He paused, jaw working. "This confrontation was inevitable. Mancini has wanted my position for years. You just gave him the excuse he needed to move openly." Kemi studied his profile in the dim light, seeing past the blood and exhaustion to something more vulnerable underneath. "Did you ever love anyone before me?" The question surprised them both. She hadn't meant to ask it, hadn't even known she wanted to know until the words were already out. Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "No," he said finally. "Love is unpredictable. Uncontrollable. Everything I was taught to avoid. And I'm predictable?" Bitterness crept into her voice. "No." He turned to look at her fully, and something raw showed in his eyes. "That's the problem. Your chaos wrapped in grace. You challenge me. Question me. Look at me like I'm just a man instead of a monster or a king, and that—" He stopped, searching for words. "That terrifies me more than any rival family ever could." Her breath caught. "Why?" "Because you make me want things I have no right to want," he said quietly. "Things that weaken me. Make me vulnerable." His hand lifted, hovering near her face before dropping back to his lap. "You don't fear me the way others do. And that's dangerous for both of us." "That's because I see the man," Kemi said softly, her anger draining away. "Not the myth. Not the title. Just you." Something broke open in his expression, a crack in the carefully maintained armor. "You shouldn't," he murmured. "Seeing me clearly makes you dangerous. Makes you a target. Makes you impossible to walk away from." She reached for his hand then, slowly, deliberately, giving him time to retreat if he wanted. He didn't pull away. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and trembling just slightly. "I'm already in danger," Kemi said, holding his gaze. "I've been in danger since Milan, since the first moment you decided I mattered. The only difference now is whether I face it alone or if we figure out how to survive it together." He squeezed her fingers just once, but the gesture felt heavier than any vow. "You won't," he said. "Be alone, I mean. Not as long as I'm breathing." "Then don't stop breathing," she whispered. "That's all I ask." That night, Kemi woke to pain that stole her breath and her reason in equal measure. Sudden. Radiating from her abdomen in waves that made her gasp and curl around herself instinctively. "No," she whimpered into the darkness. "No, no, please." Sophia was there in seconds. She must have been sleeping in the next room, must have been listening for trouble. "Kemi? Dio mio, what's wrong?" "Something's wrong." Kemi managed through the pain and the fear that was somehow worse than the physical agony. "The baby, something's wrong with the baby." Within minutes, the villa erupted into controlled chaos again. This time quieter, more desperate, everyone moving with the terrible efficiency that came from practice. The doctor was summoned from his home. Guards cleared hallways. And Lorenzo burst through the door, his shoulder freshly bandaged, his face drained of what little color the blood loss had left him. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice ragged with fear she'd never heard before. "I don't know," Kemi whispered, tears streaming down her face as another wave of pain hit. "Something's wrong. Please, I can't lose." The doctor arrived and examined her with gentle efficiency, asking questions in soft Italian that Sophia translated while Lorenzo hovered like a caged animal, useless and furious about it. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the doctor straightened, his expression grave but not hopeless. "Stress," he said, switching to heavily accented English. "Too much stress on the body. The pregnancy is viable but fragile. She needs complete rest. Complete calm. No excitement, no fear, no—" His eyes slid to Lorenzo. "No war." Lorenzo's jaw clenched so hard Kemi heard his teeth grind. "I'm fine," Kemi insisted weakly, even as her body betrayed the lie with another cramp. "The baby's fine. We just need—" "No," Lorenzo said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're not fine. Neither of you are." He dismissed everyone else with a gesture, even the doctor, even Sophia, and sat beside her on the bed, taking her hand with infinite care. "I did this," he said hoarsely, and the self-loathing in his voice was almost physical. "I dragged you into war and nearly killed you both." "No," Kemi replied, forcing strength she didn't feel into her voice. "We did this. Both of us. You didn't kidnap me from Lagos, Lorenzo. I chose Milan. I chose to answer when you showed up at my door. I chose to stay even when I could have run." He shook his head violently. "You didn't choose bullets and blood and you stood between me and those bullets," she interrupted. "You took a knife meant for me. You burned half of Naples looking for the man who threatened us." Her free hand moved to his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "That counts for something. That counts for everything." His eyes burned with unshed tears and fury and something that looked dangerously like desperation. "If anything happens to you," he started, voice breaking. "It won't," she said firmly. "Not if we change how we do this. Not if we stop pretending you can protect me through violence alone." He leaned forward slowly, pressing his forehead to hers in a gesture of intimacy they'd never shared before. His breath was warm against her lips, shaky with emotion he didn't know how to voice. "I don't know how to be half of this," he whispered. "How to choose restraint over revenge. How to let you in without getting you killed." "Then learn," Kemi said, her voice gentle but unyielding. Because I won't survive the other half. Our child won't survive it. And neither will you, Lorenzo. Not really. Not the parts of you that matter. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, she knew he was fighting the war between everything he'd been taught and everything she was asking him to become. In that moment, Lorenzo De Santis made a decision more dangerous than any he'd made before. He chose restraint over retribution. He chose to try. Outside the villa walls, Rome slept its uneasy sleep, ancient and knowing, waiting to see if love could survive in soil watered with blood. And somewhere in the south, nursing his wounds and his wounded pride, Vittorio Mancini was preparing his next move. Because now he understood something that changed the entire game. He wasn't just fighting a mafia boss protecting his territory. He was fighting a man with something to lose. And men with something to lose were the most dangerous opponents of all. The first mistake Vittorio Mancini made was assuming Kemi Johnson would break quietly. The second was thinking Lorenzo De Santis wouldn't burn the world down to get her back. The third, and fatal, was believing he'd have time for a fourth. It started 3 days after the cramping stopped, 3 days after the doctor declared the pregnancy stable if fragile, 3 days after Lorenzo had started looking at her like she was made of spun glass and prayer. Kemi was sitting in the villa's garden just after noon, sunlight filtering through ancient olive branches that had probably witnessed centuries of similar dramas. Sophia sat nearby, pretending to read a fashion magazine while actually watching everything. The perimeter guards, the security cameras, the way Kemi's hand kept moving to her stomach like she could physically protect what grew there through force of will alone. The villa felt deceptively calm. Too calm. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number with an Italian country code. She should have ignored it. Should have called for Lorenzo immediately. Should have remembered that nothing in her new life was accidental or innocent. Instead she answered, "Hello." A man's voice responded, smooth as expensive wine, Italian accent cultured and precise. "Miss Johnson. I believe we should talk." Her stomach tightened, warning bells screaming. Who is this? Someone who knows you're tired of hiding behind walls and armed men. A pause, calculated for effect. And someone who can make your life considerably easier. Sophia noticed the change in Kemi's expression immediately, her magazine forgotten. "Who is it?" she whispered urgently. Kemi shook her head subtly, trying to keep her face neutral even as her heart hammered. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man on the phone chuckled, low and knowing. "You're a smart woman, Kemi. Too smart for this life. You know it. I know it. Even Lorenzo knows it, though he's too selfish to let you go." His voice dropped, became almost gentle. "I'm offering you a way out. A chance to take your child and disappear somewhere safe. Somewhere Lorenzo's enemies, and Lorenzo himself, can never reach you." "You're one of those enemies," Kemi said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm a pragmatist," he corrected. "You shouldn't have answered this call. But I'm very glad you did." The line went dead. Kemi's hands were shaking as she lowered the phone. "Kemi?" Sophia stood, concern etched across her face. What did they? The villa's alarm screamed to life. Chaos erupted like a choreographed nightmare. Guards shouted in Italian, weapons appearing from holsters and hidden compartments. Sophia grabbed Kemi's arm with surprising strength. "Inside. Now. Muovetai." They ran toward the villa's main entrance, Kemi's hand pressed to her stomach, Sophia practically dragging her despite being 20 years older and half her size. They didn't make it 3 steps. A black panel van smashed through the side gate with a sound like the world ending. Metal shrieking, stone crumbling, alarms blaring in discordant chaos. Smoke grenades detonated with hollow thunk sounds, gray clouds billowing across the garden. Through the haze, Kemi saw figures emerging, professional, fast, tactical gear making them look inhuman. "No!" Sophia screamed, her voice raw with fury and fear. "You can't. She's pregnant, Cinta, you can't?" Gunfire cracked, sharp, controlled, terrifyingly close. Hands grabbed Kemi from behind, professional and impersonal, one arm locking around her waist while another covered her mouth before she could scream. She fought anyway, kicked, bit down hard on the gloved hand, twisted with every ounce of desperate strength her body possessed. "Calmati," a voice hissed in her ear. "Calm down. We don't want to hurt you. Don't make us hurt you. Kemi?" Sophia's scream cut through the chaos, and Kemi saw her older friend being restrained by 2 guards, tears streaming down her face. "Lorenzo. Qualcuno chiami Lorenzo." The world tilted violently as Kemi was dragged toward the van, her feet barely touching the ground. Panic exploded in her chest like a bomb, stealing her breath and her reason in equal measure. No, please, the baby please. A cloth pressed against her face, chemical sweet and nauseating. She tried to hold her breath, tried to fight the drowsiness spreading through her limbs like poison. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Sophia's anguished face. The last thought was a prayer. Lorenzo, find me. She woke to darkness and the sensation of motion, the swaying, bumping rhythm of a vehicle moving fast over uneven roads. Her head throbbed where it had hit something during the struggle, a dull ache that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Her wrists were bound but not tightly, zip ties instead of rope, careful not to cut off circulation. Professional. Whoever had taken her knew exactly what they were doing. That knowledge terrified her more than casual cruelty would have. The van stopped with a lurch that made her stomach rebel. Hands, surprisingly gentle, helped her out, guiding rather than dragging her across what felt like cobblestones. Old stone. Somewhere historic then. Somewhere with weight and history. She was led through a doorway, downstairs that smelled of mildew and age, into a room lit by a single bare bulb swinging from exposed rafters. The space was large, cavernous, probably a wine cellar or storage basement from centuries past. Water stained the walls. Chains hung from iron hooks that had probably held something very different originally. A man stepped into the circle of light. Vittorio Mancini smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "Buonasera, Signora De Santis," he said, his tone light and mocking. "Though technically you're not married yet, are you? Just expectant." Rage flared through her fear, hot and clarifying. "Don't call me that." He chuckled, moving closer with the confidence of someone who'd already won. "But you carry his heir. The first child of the next generation. The name suits you whether you want it or not." She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think past the panic. Panic wouldn't save her. Panic wouldn't protect her baby. Clarity might. Strategy might. "You won't get away with this." Vittorio shrugged, the gesture elaborately unconcerned. "I already have. Lorenzo's men are searching the wrong parts of the city. My sources are feeding them false leads. And by the time he realizes where you are," he smiled, "I'll be long gone and you'll be a very valuable bargaining chip." He began circling her slowly, predator assessing prey. "You've caused quite the disruption in our organization. Lorenzo has never been so emotional, so distracted. It's almost poetic, really. The great Lorenzo De Santis, brought low by an African woman and an unplanned pregnancy." She lifted her chin, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "You tried to kill me." "I tried to remove a problem," he corrected, his tone professorial, like explaining basic math to a slow child. "Cleanly, efficiently. But Lorenzo's protection made that complicated. So I adapted." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she smelled his cologne, expensive and cloying. "You're more valuable alive now than dead. At least temporarily." Her stomach twisted with nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. "What do you want?" "Peace," he said, spreading his hands like a benevolent priest. "Lorenzo steps down. Retires to whatever villa he prefers. Lives quietly. And in exchange you and your child get to live. Everyone wins. And if I don't cooperate?" His smile turned cold. "Then Rome watches as Lorenzo De Santis has to choose between his empire and his blood. Between power and love. Between everything he's built and the woman foolish enough to believe he could change." He leaned in, voice dropping. "How do you think that story ends, Cara?" Lorenzo felt the world tilt the moment the alarm signal cut to silence instead of continuing its pattern. The specific sequence that meant breach, intrusion, active threat. He was in a meeting with Paolo and two underbosses from the northern territories, discussing supply routes and territorial agreements. The kind of boring, necessary business that kept empires running. The phone on the table buzzed once. Twice. He grabbed it before the third ring. "See?" Ricardo's voice, tight with barely controlled panic. "Boss. The villa. They breached the garden perimeter." Lorenzo's blood turned to ice. "Kemi?" Silence. 1 second. 2. That silence told him everything. "Where is she?" His voice came out deadly calm, the kind of calm that preceded apocalyptic violence. "Taken." Ricardo's voice cracked slightly. "Black van, professional operation. They moved fast, used smoke cover. Sophia tried to stop them, she's alive but—" "Boss, I'm sorry. We're tracking but—" Lorenzo was already moving, the phone still pressed to his ear, his other hand grabbing his jacket. Paolo and the underbosses stood automatically, reading his expression and reaching for their own weapons. "Chi." "Oh." "Mancini's signature," Ricardo confirmed. Has to be. Close the city, Lorenzo said, each word clipped in absolute. Every road. Every port. Every train station and bus terminal. Nothing moves in or out of Rome without my knowledge. Boss, that will draw attention from. I don't care. The snarl in his voice made even Paolo step back. Call in every favor we're owed. Wake up every contact in the municipal government. I want police roadblocks on every major route. I want security footage from every camera within 5 kilometers of the villa. I want, his voice broke just for a second. I want her back. Now. He ended the call and looked at Paolo, at the underbosses, at Riccardo who'd appeared in the doorway. Mancini took her, he said, and his voice carried a promise that made the temperature drop. He took Kemi and my child. So we're going to find him. And when we do. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood exactly what was coming. Lorenzo De Santis had just declared war. Not the careful, strategic conflicts they'd all grown accustomed to. Not the chess games played in shadows with coded messages and plausible deniability. Real war. The kind that burned cities and ended bloodlines. The kind that didn't stop until everyone responsible was buried or begging for mercy that would never come. Phones lit up across Rome. Orders flew through encrypted channels. Men who'd been soldiers and enforcers and killers transformed into something more focused, more dangerous. Lorenzo grabbed his coat, his gun, his purpose. If Mancini touches her, he said quietly to no one and everyone, there won't be enough left of him to bury. I'll scatter his ashes in the Tiber and salt the earth where his family home stood for 3 generations. Kemi sat alone in the cold stone room for what felt like hours but was probably less. She refused to cry. Refused to beg. Refused to give Vittorio the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she thought about survival. About the baby growing inside her. About Lorenzo and the terrible certainty that he was coming for her, and what that would cost. When Vittorio returned, flanked by 2 guards, she met his gaze steadily. You miscalculated, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. He raised an eyebrow, amused. Did I? You think Lorenzo will negotiate, she continued, forcing herself to sit straighter despite the zip ties cutting into her wrists. That he'll weigh his options, consider his position, make the rational choice. You think he's a businessman playing at being a gangster? Vittorio's smile faltered, just slightly, just for a moment. He will negotiate, he said, but there was less certainty now. Because of you. Because of what you carry. She shook her head slowly. You don't understand him at all, do you? You've watched him for months, maybe years, and you still don't see it. Enlighten me, Vittorio said, his tone mocking but his eyes sharp. He doesn't see me as leverage, Kemi said quietly. He doesn't see our child as a bargaining chip or a weakness to be managed. He sees us as legacy. As the future he didn't know he wanted until it was already here. She leaned forward despite the fear churning in her stomach. And men who are building legacies don't negotiate with people who threaten them. They eliminate them. Completely. Utterly. So thoroughly that the threat becomes a warning to everyone else. Silence stretched between them, thick with implications. Vittorio opened his mouth to respond. Shouting erupted from somewhere above them. Urgent. Panicked. Then gunfire. Close. Getting closer. Explosions that shook dust from the ancient rafters. Vittorio swore viciously, rushing to the door and barking orders in rapid Italian. The door burst open with a sound like thunder. Lorenzo stood there. Blood streaked his face from a cut above his eye. His shirt was torn. His expensive suit jacket was gone. But his eyes were wild with something ancient and unstoppable, something that had nothing to do with civilization and everything to do with survival, protection, vengeance. Kemi, he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer answered. She surged to her feet despite the zip ties, despite the fear, despite everything. Lorenzo. Vittorio moved fast, pulling a weapon, raising it toward. Lorenzo shot him. Once. Twice. 3 times. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off stone walls that had probably heard similar sounds throughout centuries of violence. Vittorio collapsed, stunned, bleeding from his shoulder and thigh but alive, kept alive deliberately. You don't get to look at her again, Lorenzo snarled, placing his foot on Vittorio's chest, pressing down hard enough to make the other man gasp in pain. You don't get to breathe the same air. You don't get to exist in the same world. This war is over. You lost the moment you touched what's mine. Sirens wailed in the distance. Police or ambulance or both, the sound of consequences arriving too late to matter. Lorenzo's men flooded the room, securing the space, checking for additional threats. But Lorenzo only had eyes for Kemi. He crossed to her in 3 strides, hands shaking, actually shaking, as he pulled a knife and cut through the zip ties binding her wrists. His fingers were gentle despite the violence still humming through him, checking her for injuries with desperate thoroughness. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his voice raw. "Did the baby, Dio Kemi tell me?" "I'm okay," she managed, and then the tears came, hot and unstoppable, breaking through the control she'd maintained for hours. "We're okay. The baby's okay. I thought I'd never see you again." He pulled her into his arms without thinking, without hesitation, holding her fiercely like he could physically keep the world from ever touching her again. One hand cradled the back of her head, the other pressed against her lower back, and she felt him trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear and relief so intense it was almost painful. "I told you," he whispered roughly into her hair, his voice breaking. "Tiho promesso. I promised. I always come back. Always. There is no force on this earth that could keep me from you." She clutched his shirt, her tears soaking into the expensive fabric that smelled like gunpowder and blood in him. "I was so scared." "I know. Lo so amore mio. I know." He pulled back just enough to frame her face with his hands, his thumbs wiping away tears even as his own eyes glistened. "But you're safe now. You're with me. And I swear on my blood, on my name, on everything I am, this will never happen again." In that moment, surrounded by blood and ruin and the bodies of men who'd made the fatal mistake of threatening what Lorenzo loved, Kemi knew the truth with crystal clarity. This was no longer about survival or strategy or the careful chess games of power. This was about love forged in fire and tempered in violence. This was about a man who'd burned half of Rome to the ground in 6 hours because someone had dared to take his future. And Rome, ancient, knowing, unshakable Rome, would never be the same again. Neither would they. Rome didn't explode after the rescue. It held its breath. News spread in whispers first, through police radios, private phones, and the shadows of power where names like De Santis and Mancini carried weight heavier than law. By morning, the city woke to rumors of gunfire near Trastevere, a missing syndicate leader, and a sealed hospital wing at Policlinico Gemelli guarded by men in black. Kemi watched the news silently from Lorenzo's private suite. No names were mentioned. Not yet. Lorenzo stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, issuing calm, controlled instructions that barely hinted at the storm beneath his voice. "No retaliation unless provoked," he said. "Rome stays quiet." He ended the call and turned to her. "They're watching," he said. "The press. The families. The politicians." Kemi nodded. "And me?" "Yes." That word carried more weight than any threat. She rose slowly from the sofa. "Then we need to talk." He crossed the room. "About what?" "About what happens when this stops being private." Silence stretched. "Sit," he said. They faced each other, the distance between them smaller than ever. "You can't hide me forever," she continued. "And I won't be erased. I won't allow them to touch you," he said fiercely. "That's not the same as choosing me," she replied. The words landed hard. Lorenzo exhaled slowly. "Do you know what happens when a man like me chooses publicly?" "Tell me." "I become predictable," he said. "And predictability gets people killed." "And secrecy already has," she said softly. His jaw tightened. "Last night," she continued, "I realized something." He waited. "I'm not afraid of your world anymore," she said. "I'm afraid of losing myself inside it." That stopped him. "You don't have to belong to it," he said. "But I already do," she replied. "Because of this child. Because of you." She placed his hand gently on her stomach. His breath caught. "They'll use me," she said. "Whether you claim me or not." He closed his eyes briefly. "What are you asking?" he said. She lifted her chin. "Stand with me." The press conference was unplanned. And unavoidable. By afternoon, footage had leaked. Armed police, ambulance convoys, an unconscious Vittorio Mancini wheeled into custody under guard. The city demanded answers. Lorenzo gave them just enough. Cameras flashed as he stepped forward, immaculate in a tailored suit, expression unreadable. "I will not comment on internal disputes," he said calmly. "But Rome remains safe." A reporter shouted, "Is it true a woman was abducted?" Another yelled, "Is there a child involved?" Lorenzo's eyes flicked briefly to the side, toward Kemi standing just out of frame. The moment stretched. Then he spoke. "There was an attempt to destabilize my family," he said. "It failed." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Kemi stepped forward. Every camera snapped toward her. A black woman in a soft cream dress, one hand resting protectively over her belly. Silence fell. "This is Kemi Johnson," Lorenzo said. "She carries my child." The city exhaled. Kemi met the cameras with steady eyes. "I was taken against my will," she said. "But I'm safe. And I'm not afraid." The internet exploded within minutes. Who is she? Interracial mafia scandal rocks Rome. De Santis Heir confirmed. Inside, Lorenzo felt the walls closing in. That night, they sat together in quiet, phones buzzing endlessly on the table. "You didn't have to do that," Kemi said softly. "Yes," he replied. "I did." She searched his face. "Why now?" "Because if they're coming for you," he said, "they come through me." Emotion flickered across her expression. "You just changed everything," she said. "So did you," he replied. Later, alone on the terrace, the city lights stretching endlessly below, Kemi broke. "I'm scared," she admitted. Lorenzo stepped closer. "So am I." She turned to him. "Say it." He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "I love you," he said. The words felt dangerous. Permanent. Her breath hitched. "You don't say things like that lightly." "No," he agreed. "Which is why I waited until I was sure." She pressed her forehead to his chest. "I never planned this life. I never planned to need someone," he said. They stood there holding each other as Rome watched from afar. But peace never lasted long in their world. A message arrived minutes later. From unknown. Asterisk, "Congratulations on the heir. Let's see how long you keep them." Asterisk. Lorenzo's grip tightened. Kemi looked up. "What is it?" He showed her the screen. She didn't flinch. "They're not done," she said. "No," he agreed. "They're just getting started." Below them, sirens wailed. And somewhere beyond Rome, alliances were shifting. Because when secrets burn in the light, the ashes don't fall quietly. The threat didn't come from the streets. It came from the table. Lorenzo realized it the moment the room went quiet, not the respectful silence of obedience, but the tense stillness of men weighing their chances. They sat in the inner council chamber, the oldest room in the villa, stone walls etched with centuries of De Santis history. 5 men. 5 faces he had trusted with his life. Ricardo stood behind him, alert. Kemi watched from the far end of the room, calm on the surface, instinct screaming beneath it. "We've lost too much ground," Paolo Ferraro said carefully. "Mancini's arrest has destabilized the South. The families are nervous." "They should be," Lorenzo replied coolly. "Fear keeps them in line." Paolo exchanged a glance with Vittorio Mancini's former lieutenant. "Now their problem." "And the woman?" Paolo continued. "The public exposure was unwise." Kemi stiffened. Lorenzo's gaze sharpened. "Say what you mean." Paolo folded his hands. "She makes you vulnerable." The word hung heavy. "She makes us vulnerable," another man added. Kemi felt it then, the shift. The way their eyes no longer saw her as a person but as a liability. She rose slowly to her feet. "With respect," she said evenly, "I didn't ask to be dragged into this world." Several men looked startled. "But I'm here," she continued. "And if you think removing me fixes your problems, you're wrong." Paolo scoffed. "This is family business." "So is the child I'm carrying," she replied, unwavering. "Whether you like it or not." Lorenzo watched her carefully, pride flickering beneath his controlled expression. "You forget yourself," Paolo snapped. "No," Kemi said quietly. "I remember myself. And that's the difference." Silence fell. Then Ricardo spoke. "We have confirmation of a leak." All eyes snapped to him. "Someone tipped Mancini's allies before the arrest," Ricardo continued. "And someone leaked the press location." Lorenzo's gaze swept the table. "You," he said softly, "or you?" Paolo stiffened. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm inviting you to confess," Lorenzo replied. Paolo stood abruptly. "This madness ends now." In one fluid motion he reached into his jacket. Ricardo fired first. The shot echoed violently through the chamber. Paolo collapsed, clutching his shoulder, screaming. Guards rushed in. Lorenzo stood slowly, his voice ice cold. "Remove him." Paolo was dragged away, cursing. Kemi's heart pounded, but she didn't look away. When the doors closed, Lorenzo turned to the remaining men. "This ends today," he said. "Loyalty or death. There is no middle." No one spoke. That night, Kemi couldn't sleep. She stood on the balcony, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the city she now understood far too well. Lorenzo joined her quietly. "You shouldn't have spoken," he said softly. She glanced at him. You didn't stop me. No, he admitted. Because you were right. She turned fully to him. They don't see me as a woman. Or a mother. They will, he said. Or they'll be gone. She studied him. You're changing. So are you. She smiled faintly. I don't know if that's good. It's necessary, he replied. Her hand found his. This time he didn't hesitate. The attack came at dawn. Explosions rocked the eastern gate, shattering glass and stone. Gunfire erupted instantly. Kemi was already awake. She moved quickly, calm, deliberate, exactly as Lorenzo had trained her. Sophia grabbed her arm. This way. They didn't make it far. A masked man appeared at the end of the hall, weapon raised. Before he could fire, Kemi grabbed a heavy marble statue and shoved it forward. It smashed into him with a sickening crack. She froze, then kept moving. In the courtyard, chaos reigned. Lorenzo fought like something unleashed, fury and precision in every movement. Kemi, he shouted. She ran toward him. A gunshot rang out. She stumbled, then felt Lorenzo's arms around her. I'm here, he breathed. I've got you. Blood stained his sleeve. You're hurt, she gasped. It's nothing, he said. Ricardo appeared, grim. Paolo's men. Last stand. Lorenzo nodded once. End it. Minutes later it was over. Smoke curled into the morning sky. Bodies lay still. Kemi stood shaking, adrenaline fading. Lorenzo cupped her face gently. You saved yourself. And you, she said quietly. His forehead rested against hers. This is what it means now. She nodded. I know. By evening, the villa was quiet again. Too quiet. Kemi lay in bed, exhaustion heavy in her bones. Lorenzo sat beside her. You should leave, he said suddenly. She looked at him sharply. No. If this continues? I won't run, she said firmly. Not now. Not ever. He searched her face. You'd risk everything. She placed his hand over her heart. I already have. Emotion broke through his control. You're stronger than any of them, he whispered. And you're not alone anymore, she replied. Outside, Rome glowed beneath a darkening sky. But far beyond the city, another family watched. And they were not finished. The war didn't end with gunfire. It ended with a decision. Rome woke under gray skies, the kind that pressed low against the city like history itself was watching. Lorenzo stood alone in the private chapel beneath the villa, a place few had ever seen, let alone entered. Candles flickered along stone walls carved with names of men who had ruled, killed, and died in silence. His ancestors. Men who had chosen power over peace every time. Behind him, footsteps echoed softly. Kemi entered slowly, her presence shifting the air in the room. She wore black, not for mourning but for gravity. One hand rested on her stomach, steady and sure. This is where you decide things, isn't it? She asked quietly. Yes, Lorenzo replied. Where De Santis men decide what survives. She stepped closer, studying the names. And what dies? He turned to face her. There's one family left. She already knew. The Sicilian Syndicate. They're offering alliance, he said. Marriage. Blood contracts. Protection. Her jaw tightened. And the price. You leave Rome, he said. You disappear. The child becomes a name, not a face. Silence fell. Kemi breathed deeply. And if you refuse? Open war, he said. No borders. No restraint. She walked to him then, placing her hand over his heart. You once told me love makes a man predictable, she said softly. Yes. And fear makes him cruel. Yes. She met his eyes. What does hope make him? Lorenzo swallowed. I don't know, he admitted. Then choose it, she said. For once. The meeting was held at dusk. Old stone estate. Neutral ground. Armed men lining the perimeter like statues carved from menace. The Sicilian envoy smiled when Lorenzo entered. You come alone, the man observed. No, Lorenzo said calmly. Kemi stepped forward beside him. Gasps rippled through the room. This is my family, Lorenzo said. All of it. The envoy's smile faded. You defy tradition. I redefine it, Lorenzo replied. You'll be destroyed. Then you'll remember my name longer, Lorenzo said evenly. The envoy studied Kemi. She will die first. Before Lorenzo could respond, Kemi spoke. No, she said clearly. You won't touch me. The men laughed. Kemi didn't flinch. Because if I fall, she continued, every secret I know goes public. Every politician. Every account. Every bloodline. Silence slammed into the room. Lorenzo stared at her, shock, admiration, awe colliding. The envoy's face hardened. You bluff. Kemi smiled slightly. Try me. Minutes stretched. Then the envoy rose. This ends in truce, he said tightly. Rome is yours. They left without another word. Lorenzo stood frozen. You prepared that, he said. Yes, she replied. While you were busy protecting me. He laughed softly, once, then pulled her into his arms. You just saved my empire, he murmured. No, she said. I saved our family. Months later, Rome felt different. Quieter. Sharper. Watching. Lorenzo dismantled parts of the syndicate no one thought he would touch. He stepped out of shadows and into legitimacy, not clean but cleaner. Kemi moved freely now. No guards hovering. No locked doors. She stood on the terrace one morning, sunlight warming her skin, as Lorenzo joined her with 2 cups of coffee. You're late, she teased. I was arguing with politicians, he said dryly. Less honest than gangsters. She laughed. He knelt suddenly, pressing a kiss to her stomach. Hello, he whispered. I hope you forgive me someday. She smiled, eyes wet. Do you regret it? She asked. He looked up. Choosing you? Yes. He stood, brushing his thumb across her cheek. I regret every day I didn't. The church bells rang across Rome. Life continued. But this time it belonged to them. If this story made your heart race, if you felt the danger, the love, the impossible choices, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. This is Afro-Italian Stories TV, where love crosses bloodlines, power meets passion, and no story plays it safe. Like if you want more intense mafia romance. Comment what you'd do if you were Kemi. Subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Because the next story might be even darker. And the baby? That story is just beginning.